Our third speaker is Nida Aref, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of English in the University of Delhi. Her doctoral thesis is tentatively titled Arabs, in adverted commas, Political Consciousness and Rassan Kanafani's Adab al-Mukawwama, the literature of resistance. She has translated parts of Rassan Kanafani's work, originally written in Arabic, into English for her doctoral research. Her areas of interest include resistance literature, trauma and memory studies, philosophy of writing, and post-colonial writing and practice. Nida, the floor is yours, and we're very happy to have you with us.
Okay. Hi. Okay. Okay. Hi. What I would do intend to do is to look at India and Israel's relationship and what it is now becoming. India did not have a full-scale diplomatic relations with Israel until 1991, though we did have a relationship at a consulate level with Israel. Today, we are the largest importer of Israel's weapons. Zionism, with its governing idea of ethno nationalism, has an easy counterpart in an ideology which plagues much of India, that is, Hindutva. We need to take a look at it to understand how and why the change happened in India's attitude towards Israel. Hindutva is a concept of Indian cultural, national, and religious identity. The term conflicts a geographically based religious, cultural, and national identity. A true Indian is one who take part in Hinduness, and this Hinduness is not well defined. Like Israel is a natural abode of all Jews all over the world, so is India, according to Hindutva, or Bharat, a natural abode of all Hindus. So there is no clarity as to who is a Hindu. Early ideologues of Hindutva believe that all Hindus are reunited in the form that all echo Vedas. It is a very vague definition, but it holds a kernel that it holds a kernel of the idea what as to what this ideology would develop into. That is a form of a cultural imperialism, assimilationism. Hindu then becomes all those religions who do not originate in India: Muslims, Christian, Parsis, or Westerns, or Jews. So everyone but these four religions is a Hindu. It is, in a sense, an ideology that seeks to homogenize an otherwise a very complex, diverse society, one nation, one culture. It is also motivated by a territorial aspiration symbolized in what is called Akhand Bharat, that is, undivided, unbroken India, which will comprise of not only the British India, but that was India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan of the present day, but Myanmar, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, and at times nations that are in Far East as well. Sometime in the romantic past, the idea being that sometime in the romantic past, an undivided, unbroken India was all a singular entity in a cultural religious terms, and that same unity with its Hinduness has to be reclaimed. Our national movement, our anti-colonial movement against British Empire had both these conceptions of nationality and citizenship. An ethno-nationalist one and a secular one. In 1925, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh was founded, RSS, an organization which typifies the second kind of concept of nationalism, and an organization with the formal face of Hindutva. There exist as leaders in other organizations who are similarly exclusive ideas about India. The point being that what I'm trying to say that the idea of Hindutva just didn't remain confined to the RSS, and it spread to other affiliated bodies who were at that time part of a national movement. They looked for inspiration to the ethno nationalism of Zionism. For instance, a very celebrated Indian freedom fighter, Lala Lajpat Rai, wrote after his travels in Ottoman Empire that Russian Europe is creating a strong and well protected Ulster in Palestine. So, like Indian national movement leaders were looking at Palestine, and those who subscribe with this kind of ethno nationalism founded the ongoing exercise admirable. According to second RSS shift, but RSS remains the most virulent form of this ideology. And one has to just look at the literature of its founders. See, for instance, that the second RSS chief, M.S. Golwalkar, stated that Muslim could either adopt the Hindu religion and all, or in light of all what we talked of supremacy that drive apartheid, Muslim could either adopt the Hindu religion or live wholly subordinated, claiming nothing, deserving no privilege, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights. So this is exact quote from his book, Our Nationhood. From 1980s, political outfits associated with the RSS began to have significant electoral success. The defining moment comes in 1992 when RSS ideologues began a campaign that mobilized forces that demolished our national heritage, Babri Mosque, because they believed it was constructed at the site of a Hindu deity, Lord Ram's birthplace. I was born after Babri Mosque demolition, and I'm culturally a Muslim. My father talks of India in terms of pre and post Babri Mosque demolition, as if to articulate the change that happened in the social fabric with that instance. Last year, the Supreme Court of India ruled on the case and allotted the disputed site, the desecration ground of Babri Mosque, to to the temple desecrated ground of Babri Mosque to have a temple constructed over the same area, the temple for Lord Ram. BDS India reported last year that India's arms trade with Israel is now of $1 billion. Equipment that are brought from Israel have been installed in Kashmir to put Kashmiris under greater surveillance. If one wants to gauge the similarities between India and Israel, one has to take a look at Hebron and then Kashmir. Kashmir is one of the world's most militarized zones. In August 2019, the government of India, through a presidential order and a series of parliamentary acts, took the autonomy from the state of Jammu and Kashmir and organized it into a union territory. So, within Indian polity, union territories are bodies that are governed by the central government. So, Kashmir now has no form of self governance available to them. So, internet services were cut off, and in the 21st century, in the largest democracy of the world, a section of its people have lived for more than a year with 2G internet services. So, Kashmir got internet, I think, just few weeks back. So, the same year, Parliament of India passed what came to be known as, that is 2019, came to be known as Citizenship Amendment Act. Many argued that India's Citizenship Amendment Act was inspired or at least emboldened by Israel's nation state law. There are definitely uncanny similarities between the two. The act said, and this is the quote from the act, that any particular person belonging to Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, or Christian community from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan who entered into India on or before the 31st of December 2014 shall be granted citizenship. In stating the purpose of the act, it was said that each of these communities face persecution on religious ground in the aforementioned countries. It was said that the act would provide citizenship to religiously persecuted minorities from our three neighboring nations, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, each of which is a Muslim majority country. So, in effect, anyone but Muslims from these nations could be granted citizenship of India. There were plans to make a national register for citizenship, where the burden of proof for proving one's citizenship would fall squarely with the persons. So, the so those non-Muslims who were left out of this register, if this exercise is put into effect, could get a citizenship through the newly opened pathway. It not only violated the promise of our constitution, the promise of equality in the Republic of India, but created a situation where a large population could be left stateless. Though the government denied that they had no plans for building of detention camps, journalists argued, and this is very well documented, that there are detention centers in the northeastern state of Assam where the NRC exercise had already occurred. Questions are being raised about the working of foreigners tribunal in the state of Assam. So the NRC exercise, those who were not able to prove their citizenship were put before this foreigners tribunal. And now we are getting evidences and records which state that the working of this tribunal is very arbitrary. So we protested against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and it was a historic protest. The whole India was on road, but a large section of India's population remained alienated from these protests. There were two reasons for this alienation. Firstly, because the primary victim of this entire NRCCA exercise were Muslims, a group against which the social apathy is perhaps the highest at the moment in India's history. Secondly, and probably more importantly, because it drew on some liberal goodwill, a liberal goodwill that deems that religious persecution to be wrong and feels moral claims in granting refuge to these persecuted minority. It took so much of our time and labor to make the incendiary nature of the act and register understood. And this is even before we got to the problem of addressing apathy against Muslims. It is a kind of an intellectual trap which people have feared, uh, just to draw a similarity with the adoption of IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. One has to first acknowledge first the very real threat menace of anti-Semitism, and then explain why why criticizing Israel is not an act of anti-Semitism. Similarly, we had to, during a protest, had to acknowledge first the truth of the religious persecution which happens against minorities in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and then explain that opposition to this act was not opposing the giving refuge to the persecuted. As protests intensified, an anti-Muslim pogrom was unleashed in northeast Delhi. As things stand now, the act is still in effect, but the guidelines for applying it have not been released, and the threat of the National Register of Citizenship looms over us. As a research scholar, my work is on Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian Arab revolutionary writer who first conceptualized the literature of resistance or resistance literature. Kanafani understood the importance of language to resistance. I learned it through painstaking labor and painful experience. I stay in Delhi, so I was not very far off from where these pogroms were unleashed, and we were involved in relief work. The importance and so that's the painful experience. The important and necessity of speaking up and saying it again. The domain of language expression is the first domain of resistance for the persecuted and often the only domain available to them. We have to be right about terminology. We should articulate, we should reiterate, and we resist. We have a responsibility to speak truthfully, loudly, creatively, and in view of the shrinking space, recklessly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nida. Thank you so much for this very moving presentation. I want